individual was in the military for Colombia. He had to leave because of the threats to him from the narcos, and came here from living very privileged to having nothing. And you took it upon yourself to take this gentleman and introduce him to a real hero of Utah. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Welcome to Motivational Monday, Conversations with David Ibarra, and our guest today is Keith Atkinson. Welcome, Keith.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, David.
Well, I'm really excited to have a conversation with you, Keith, and to dive into your life, your work, and all of the many great things that you've done. Now, for the audience, I've known Keith for a long time.
Yep.
And I want to share that with them. I'd like to start, Keith. Would you tell us about when your early years in Hollywood and film and what you did in that arena?
Well, but let me tell you a little bit about how I got there. I was raised in Yakima, Washington, where they, grow most of the apples for the country, and in a very low economic part of town. And always, for some reason, wanted to be an actor because I felt like that would get me out of where I was. And when I graduated from high school, went to work at the local television station. And then after that, through a series of incidents, ended up coming to know the missionaries from the LDS Church a little better. And before long, I was off on a mission to Mexico. But I never lost my dream. All that time I was there, I felt like one day I'm going to do something that enables me to come back and be of service to the Latino people here in Mexico and elsewhere throughout Latin America. And I came back and went on to college, even though, by the way, I don't know if I should reveal this to your audience, but I graduated from high school because I was such a contrary personality and graduated from high school with a 1.4 GPA. My heavens.
Now, most of the people don't know that I graduated from high school with a 1.86. Now, I hadn't heard of anybody that had a lower one than me, Keith. So you must have gone down this similar path that I did.
It was tough. My poor parents, they had a tough time.
But I sure had fun in high school.
Well, I don't know if I had fun, but I did have some fun. But at any rate, when I got through high school, went to the local junior college, and immediately found college to be a much more conducive environment to my personality.
Yes.
People didn't care if you went to class, but they did care if you got your work done and if you passed the tests.
Right.
And I liked that idea. They treated you like an adult. And my first semester, I think I pulled a 3.5. And then on from there, and I came to BYU after my mission and graduated at the top of my class.
Wow.
So there's hope for all of you out there who may be watching who are perhaps not even graduating.
Well, neither Keith or I did well in high school. I think we both have done well in life. So I agree with you. I gained my discipline at a junior college, community college as well.
Oh,
Continue.
Good for you.
Tell me about.
So I came to BYU, and as I was about to graduate from BYU, the BYU at that particular time had a very active motion picture department. Some former employees of Disney had come up and started it, and they drafted me to come work for them. I was about to go into the military, and then I got a 1Y from the military, if you remember what that was. I had at the time, I think, a peptic ulcer, and so they didn't want to pay my medical bills. And so they said, no, you stay there, and we'll draft you when we draft widows and orphans. And so I stayed there, and I began to work at the motion picture studio at BYU and did several films for them. And then at 1973, decided it was time for me to move to Hollywood. And I did. I just gotten married a year before that, and moved to Hollywood and got an apartment on a place called Pacific Palisades on Sunset Boulevard and began knocking on doors. And it was tough. I mean, I was new in town. I was not a member of the Screen Actors Guild. And my landlady, who I lived above on Sunset Boulevard, would watch me come down those stairs every day and go out and knock on doors. And finally one day she met me at the bottom of the stairs and she said, "What are you trying to do?" And I said, I'm trying to break into Hollywood as an actor. I want to become an actor and a director. And she said, do you mind if I help you?
Really?
Really? And I said, no, of course. And so she introduced me to a friend of hers who was a director for television, a wonderful man from England by the name of Phil Leacock. Uh-huh. And he used to do a lot of television series. And I met Phil, and Phil was doing the Waltons. And he said, you come out. And he said, I want you to play the part of a proctor in one of the episodes of the Waltons. And that was my first break in Hollywood. Great. Like I say, didn't have a Screen Actors Guild card, but he went ahead and submitted the paperwork, and I got my Screen Actors Guild card, and we went on from there. And I kept knocking on doors, and Hollywood's an interesting place to work. And it's tough on marriages, it's tough on families, but it's also tough personally. You have to kind of develop an attitude that says, even though I've done good work in the past, I can never rely on the past. I always have to prove myself every time I go in for a read. Right. Every time I go in to get a director's job, I have to prove myself anew. Even if I have worked for the producer or the director before, every time is a new start. And then when you make the money, because you make good money for the time you're working, but you may go a month or two between jobs, and your spouse has to get used to that. My first spouse did not. I'd make good money, and I'd say, okay, we've got to save this for a rainy day in case I don't work for 3 weeks, and I'd turn around, the money would be gone. That was very strenuous, but I met some wonderful people.
What kind of other roles did you have, and what kind of projects were you involved as far as directing? And I understand you did some writing as well.
I did. I did some writing and did some directing. Most of the work I did was for television. I did a couple of features. The most famous feature I was involved in was Close Encounters of a Third Kind. I'm in that particular movie for an eye blink. A few seconds, and met Mr. Spielberg, Steven Spielberg, who was one of the great gentlemen of Hollywood, really. Wonderful guy to work for. But most of my work was in television. Soap operas, episodic television, Marcus Welby, McLeod, Gunsmoke, you go on and on.
Right.
And then during a writer's strike, interestingly enough, I happened to meet the producer of Gunsmoke. And he said, I can't hire you right now. We've got a writer's strike, but you come see me afterwards. I wrote for them, and he had me do a 20-year retrospective on Gunsmoke. And that was my start in kind of producing in Hollywood.
Right.
I did do a lot of directing, and as I got more involved, I directed episodic television things, like I call it puffed rice. BJ and the Bear, Hardy Boys.
Right.
But as I became more involved in that, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would come to me and say, would you do some of our home front spots for us? They were doing a lot of commercials at the time that promoted family unity that were seen on network television. And they would come and ask me to do those. And then later on, they asked me to do several documentaries for them on members of the church in foreign countries. So that's mainly what I did in Hollywood until... In 1988, the church came to me and said, look, have you read the book called Mormon Murders? And I had. I don't know if you remember that book.
No.
There was a man here in Salt Lake City at the time by the name of Mark Hoffman. Do you remember the Mark Hoffman case?
Certainly.
And, he became the world's most prolific forger.
Right. And I believe that Mr. Mack from the clothing store's son-in-law was killed. Was killed,
and also a lady appeared that was the wife of one of the of a gentleman. Anyway, Mark Hoffman was the world's most prolific forger. He forged documents from Abraham Lincoln, from Betsy Ross, and I've forgotten the one big document he forged, which finally brought him down. They finally caught it. But he got documents past the Library of Congress, got them past the U.S. Mint, and finally he was, he ran out of creative juices, which I think happens to all people who engage in that kind of evil. But after he had committed the murders here in Salt Lake City, and was tried. There were two men out of New York who wrote a book, and they labeled it Mormon Murders. And in that book, it was a real hatchet job on President Gordon B. Hinckley of the LDS Church at the time. And they blamed him for everything because of what the church believes, that Mark Hoffman did what he did, and blah, blah, blah. And, of course, it was all, like I say, a hatchet job, very journalism. And but CBS had picked that up to do a movie of the week.
Wow.
And Gordon B. Hinckley, whom I think you knew.
Yes, I did meet him. It was fabulous.
Wonderful man. And he was very concerned that people would get the wrong impression of the church should they go forward with this movie, paying him as the heavy as they wanted to do. And so the church came to me and said, listen, you've got a certain amount of leverage here in Hollywood. Would you join our public affairs department and help make sure that this movie presents a more even-handed view? And I agreed to do that. By that time, I'd become an active member of the church. I got involved in the church when I was 19, and then went on the mission, like I said, to Mexico, and got involved and began to. I contacted CBS. I had friends there, and I said, will you give me the producer's name and may I contact him? And here's what I'm trying to do. And they said, sure. And I contacted Zeb Ron, was his name. I think Zeb is still alive. I hope so. Good man. And we met and read the script, and I explained to Zeb the parts of the script that were objectionable to us. And Zeb said, Keith, I promise you I'll go back. I'll do an entirely new script and bring it to you in a couple of weeks. And he did. I read the new script, and I said, Zeb, you've kept your word. You've taken out all the objectionable parts, but what you're left with is a mundane cops and robbers story. And I can assure you, CBS, which has already paid more money for the rights to this book than anything they've done so far, they're not going to pay any more money to produce a mundane cops and robbers story. You got to get back into this story and get into the psyche of Mark Hoffman and determine what makes a young boy, because apparently at the age of 14, Mark Hoffman, according to another book about the case called Salamander, had determined to bring down God. And I said, what makes a young man at 14 make the determination that he has the power and even the desire to bring God down? I said, that's what you have to get into. So he went back to rework the script. And finally, at the end of the day, there was another producer in town that was doing a story called Go Toward the Light, about the first Mormon boy in California who came down with AIDS. He happened to be a member of the LDS Church, and he was a hemophiliac. And he picked up AIDS through a blood transfusion.
Right.
And Beth Polson was her name, the producer, and she was doing a movie about this boy and his life and his parents getting him ready to make the transition into death. And CBS said, this is a very simple story, and we don't know how it's going to do, but they put it up against an NBC blockbuster called Favorite Son, and it knocked NBC off the charts. It won the ratings award that CBS had not won for 5 years. And so Jeff Zagansky, who was the VP of programming at CBS at the time, called Zeb Ron in and said, Zeb, we're canceling your movie.
Wow.
And that's how I first got involved. And then I so enjoyed being the representative of the church in public affairs at that time in what they call the North America West area, which was California and Hawaii, that I continued with it, even though initially I had told them I would only give them 3 years.
Now, you worked in that role for how many years?
Oh, gosh, it was from 1988 until 2010 when they brought me up here. I was in California and Hawaii, and then they added to my area after that, South America South, which was Argentina, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Chile. And so for about 3 years, I flew between the two every couple of weeks, taking care of things. Then 2010, after the Prop 8 contest in California, the church said, we recognize after Prop 8, and the Prop 8 in California won because of the Hispanic vote. in California.
Right.
It later lost in the California Supreme Court.
Right.
But the church recognized, I think, from my perspective, for the first time, the power of the surging Latino vote. Mm-hmm. And they said to me, listen, we think we've done a pretty good job at communicating with Latinos south of the Rio Grande, but when they come north, something happens and we lose a lot of them. And would you, with your experience in South America and in Mexico and in California, would you come up here and help us better communicate with the Hispanic Latino audience nationwide? So in 2010, I moved up here to Salt Lake City to begin that endeavor. And that's when I met you.
And take a moment and picture in your mind igniting your child's journey to lifelong success from an early age. With Yes, Our Kids Can, this vision becomes a reality right from preschool. Don't miss this chance to shape your child's path towards extraordinary success. Enroll in the Yes, Our Kids Can University now and witness the remarkable impact it can have on your child's growth and development. Secure your child's bright future today. Sign up now by clicking the link below. I've always, as you know, been involved in the Latino community.
Yes.
I don't speak Spanish, and it's interesting. You do.
Yeah.
And while in foster care, I was baptized in the faith of the family that was raising me, the LDS faith. I didn't continue after that family I left, but I've always had a great deal of respect.
Yes, you have.
For the LDS Church, and I remember I was at a soccer stadium. They had an event, Real,
yeah,
and I heard this individual with an unbelievable radio voice, and when you walked in the room dressed to the nines, and that voice, right away we connected and started talking about how is it that we could help young folks find their purpose and achieve it. And I shared with you that I had founded the Ibarra Foundation, and we were involved in scholarships, and right away we just connected.
We did.
And became great friends.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about the experience that you've had in Utah. And the one thing that, Keith, that I want this audience to know, while you're a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and you had a position with them, you were a representative for all people.
Boy, I hope
all
so.
people.
I hope so.
And kind to all people. You didn't walk in and are you a member or aren't you a member? You just treated everyone. What do you need and how can I help you get that? We got involved together in a lot of different issues, certainly SOMOS and the scholarship foundations and what have you. But tell me a little bit about your experience of working in Utah and what were some of the highlights?
Well, I'll tell you, when I first got to Utah, first of all, I do not like cold weather. And I came in 2010. It was very cold. But I had agreed to help the church in reaching out to the national Hispanic Latino population. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the church has never tried to limit me. When I grew up in Yakima, I left home at 12. Mm-hmm. And I was taken in by a local family that was childless. But they were Southern Baptists and just wonderful people. I mean, they believed differently, but they were wonderful people. And I think I learned at that very early age just to appreciate all people for the good that they do and for the good that is in them. And I've kind of carried that with me, and the church has been very encouraging that way. And I think they recognize that I relate to everybody. And I mean, even to this day, as you know, there's a war going on in the Middle East, in Gaza and Lebanon. And I won't tell you who he is, but a very high government official there communicates with me almost weekly. He lives in Tel Aviv, and where the missiles are falling. And he texted me yesterday and said, thank you for your prayers. We are still safe. And I've been blessed to be able to do that. I mean, I appreciate everybody. And when I met you, there was just something about you. And even though you didn't speak Spanish, and I was disappointed in that, David, you need to learn to speak Spanish. There was such a passion and a feeling that comes with the language when the people speak it at times, that you wish that everybody could understand the wonderful sense of family and camaraderie, friendship that so many Latinos have. And I love the language, and I speak it every day to somebody somewhere. And as you know, I've lived in Latin America since coming here. I was on a mission recently in Guatemala.
Right.
And just wonderful people. But working here for the church, I found here in Salt Lake City, working for the church in Salt Lake is much different than working for the church out in the field. You know, here, all of the leadership and the bureaucracy that the hierarchical leadership of the churches had to build up in order to implement their vision. Everybody lives in a fishbowl. And so it's a little more difficult to get things done. I remember when I was living in Chile, Elder Jeffrey Holland was the area president down there, and he was so happy all the time. And one day I said to him, Elder Holland, why are you so happy all the time? He said, Keith, he said, think about the blessing. We live here in Chile, so many thousands of miles away from Salt Lake City. We make decisions and can actually get them done today.
Right.
and I thought that was great. When I moved here, I found two things were a difficult challenge. One was the weather. The other was the local politic. At that time, if you remember 2010, the legislature here on Capitol Hill was rather anti-immigrant. Right. And they weren't treating too many of the Latinos the way they should. Now, if you know about the Church of Jesus Christ and what it believes, and in addition to the Bible, which is sacred to them, they also have the Book of Mormon, which, as they believe it, is the history of God's dealings with man on the American continent at the same time that he was dealing with man in the old world or in the time of the Bible. So to Mormons, the Latino people are sacred people, and that they should ever be mistreated by the legislature or anybody else is somehow anathema to the way I perceive the faith. And so that was very difficult for me. But I bumped into a former FBI agent at an event. I went to a Ramadan dinner for the Islamic community at the University of Utah, and he'd been the former section chief for the FBI in Kansas City. And we were chatting, and he asked me how I liked Utah, and I explained to him that I was having a challenge with these two issues, and he said, do you know anything about the politics in Kansas City? And I said, as a matter of fact, I do. And he laughed and he said, well, here it's worse. Fortunately, it seems to me the legislature has matured since that time to some extent, and they're not as bad that way. But I have found, I also found here, coming to Salt Lake City for me was a challenge because while my department, Public Affairs, which no longer exists, by the way, it is now the Church Communication Department, and their focus is quite different. But when I came here, the church saw the need, but not necessarily everybody in my department. And so I was sitting at a table where the resources were all used up, and I was waiting for them to say, you have this many resources, and they didn't. I found I had to kind of sit at the table and elbow my way in, and then use a lot of my own resources, frankly, to begin to do the assignment which I had been given. And I traveled to Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, becoming acquainted with the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, with LULAC, Latin American, you know who they are, and others, but made friends rather quickly. I mean, these were good people that were interested in making progress in their relationship with the LDS community. And so before too many years, we had the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce came to Salt Lake City and had one of the largest conventions ever. LULAC came here and had a very successful convention. We haven't had the U.S.-Mexico Chamber of Commerce come here for a convention yet. They've come here for several meetings and receptions And in fact, they helped sponsor a reception I did for the Mexican consul general here at one time, or the man, no, he was Mexican ambassador with a few years ago. So
and they even had the ex-president of Mexico here, Vicente Fox.
Yes, Vicente Fox was here.
Right.
Now, when he first came here, I hadn't moved to Salt Lake City yet. When he came the second time, I had.
Well, that's when I met him the second time.
Yes, interesting fellow, Vicente Fox.
Very.
Yes, I was intrigued, because they have so many challenges in Mexico with the narcos. I was intrigued that Vicente Fox was promoting his marijuana line. So he has a marijuana line that he's promoting and selling, and I thought that was kind of interesting. But he's himself a very, very charming individual.
Very charming, ex-executive with Coca-Cola.
Pepsi, I think it was.
Pepsi? Yes. I thought it was Coca-Cola. But at any rate, we'll do a fact check
afterwards. There you go.
But at any rate, was there any one or two individuals that you became acquainted with while here in Utah that impacted your life in any way, just the relationship? I'm thinking of one you introduced me to, but I'll let you tell me the two or three Utah leaders that just were impactful in their openness, in their a want to do good by others.
Well, certainly you were on the top of that list, David, because when I met you, I found somebody who was immediately willing to engage the Latino community by providing scholarships to those who wanted to go on to college. And you weren't just throwing money at it. You were actively engaged. You want to know what the students were going to study, what they were going to do. You followed up with them year after year, which I found very impressive because a lot of people didn't do that. They just threw money at them. If I may be so, and this may be jumping ahead of the game, but I was also impressed. I came to you one time, so many of the students going through the Latino community that are going on to college, because just we live in a community which is dominated to some extent by the Church of Jesus Christ, and so many of them are of that faith. And but I would come to people sometimes and say, here's a family or a group of kids that are not of that faith, but these are good kids and they really want to go on to college. Right. And most people would be very supportive. On occasion, some would not. You were hands down supportive. In fact, I came to you not long ago, even after I had retired, and I said, I know this family from Colombia, and they are great kids, and I need to have you meet them. And you did. And the first time you met these kids, there were three of them, 2 boys and a girl. And when you met these kids, you said, you talked to them about what their goals were, et cetera, and you gave them a copy of your book and told them to go and read it. You didn't write them a check. They read your book, and they got back with you, and you gave each one of them not a small scholarship, a considerable scholarship. And whether you know it or not, the girl is now finishing dental school at the U of U.
Their last name?
Novoa.
Yes. Well, I was kind of fishing a little on that because I wasn't fishing about a story about me, but I was fishing about a story about their father.
Well,
their father, you connected to somebody who I think was very impactful in Utah and helped this individual was in the military for Colombia, had to leave because of the threats to him from the narcos, and came here from living very privileged to having nothing. And you took it upon yourself to take this gentleman and introduce him to a real hero of Utah. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
I will. The man's name is, as you say, Novoa. And when I was here in fulfilling my responsibility to communicate on a broader basis with the Latino community on behalf of the church, when they would have dignitaries come to Utah, we would hold a reception for them. And in this case, the Attorney General of Colombia came to town, and we held a reception for him. And at this reception, I was approached by this man. He was like 6'2", colonel's uniform, I mean, just as erect, and I mean, he was impressive. And he came to me, introduced himself, and he said, "My name is such and such, Colonel Novoa." And he said, I said, "Well, sir, are you accompanying the Attorney General?" He said, "No." He said, "I moved here a few years ago because the Colombian government said I had a price on my head from the narcos and I had to take a sabbatical. So I came here, and we're living here now, and, my family loves it." And
Right.
he said, I don't know you, but he said, "I have a feeling," he said, "could you possibly help me find work?"
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, tell me about yourself. Are you having problems finding work?" He said, "Well, listen," he said, I have several degrees, I have, etc., but people tell me I'm overqualified." And he did. He had
Yes.
like a couple of PhDs.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Well, what are you doing now for work?" And he told me he was working at a quarry up in Park City. And I said, "Well," I said, "let me think about this, and I'll get back with you." They were not members of the Church of Jesus Christ, by the way.
Right.
This is a good Catholic family.
Right.
And I thought about it, and I happened to be, I got a call from the Honorary Consul General of Chile here in town, and he said, "I have to go to Los Angeles to meet with the Consul General from Mexico." He said, "Because you were in L.A. and you know this man, would you accompany me and introduce me to him?" So I said, "Sure." And this was a man by the name of Curtis Bennett, who at the time was the manager of the O.C. Tanner retail operation here.
Mm-hmm.
And we make the flight down, but we're coming back, and I have this flash, and I turned to Curtis, and I said, "Curtis, I don't know why I'm having this flash, but I said, I met this man from Colombia, and he needs help. And I said, is there anybody in your circle of acquaintance that you could introduce me to that might be able to help this man?" And Curtis said, "Keith, I think I may have somebody." I said, "Who is it?" And he told me. He said, "There's this guy that has a factory outside of Payson called Temkin International." Said he was born in Uruguay to Israeli parents.
Mm-hmm.
Raised in Uruguay. He's now an Israeli citizen, but he runs this factory, and he has a factory in Bogota, and he has a factory in Toronto and one in Miami. And he makes all this plastic wrapping for your grocery products and plastic bags for everything else. And he said his name is Daniel Temkin. And he said, "Danny might be interested." I said, "How soon can I meet him?" He said, "I'll make a phone call as soon as we get back." He did. I talked to Danny on the phone. Danny and I, for some reason, hit it off. We spoke in Spanish, by the way. Mm-hmm. We hit it off, and Danny was a former member of the Israeli Mossad.
Right.
So he'd had some military experience. He said, "Keith," he said, "you bring Mr. Novoa up to my house this Saturday." He said, "At this time," he said, "I'm going to meet with you," and he said, I'll talk with you and see what I can do." So I took Raphael up that weekend. We met with Danny. Danny wouldn't let us go. He fed us lunch and said, finally, after 3 hours, he said, "Okay," he said, "you go and I will tell you, I'll get back with you on Monday." So on Monday, he calls Novoa, and he says, "Come see me." And he did. And he offered Novoa a job at X amount of dollars a year.
Right.
But it was a good salary for this area. And Colonel Novoa called me. He said, "Keith," he said, he was so excited.
Right.
He said, "The first real opportunity I've had." He offered me this amount, and I said, "Colonel, don't accept it." He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Don't accept it." He said, "No, you got to be kidding me." I said, "No." He said, "This is what you do. You go back to Danny and you say, 'Danny, I am so appreciative. I do so appreciate what you've offered me. But, with my obligations, my 3 children,
Yeah.
and 2 of them now going to college, one going to college in a year or so, with the obligations I have, I'd hoped for a little more.'" So Danny looked at him, and Danny said, "I don't negotiate. But for you, I'll give you 12,000 more."
Right. Well, Keith, that was the name I was looking for. Danny was just quite an incredible success story in the state of Utah. Helped that family. You bring them in, and I got to tell you something. They are on the episode that will be shown shortly with us. And I have all 4 of them, and it was just a great experience. You introduced me to them, great young men and woman, and what a family. And I want to thank you for being on our program. We're going to conclude now. And most of all, I want to thank you for the contribution that you made to Utah. You come to Utah, and you made it a better place, and you improved the lives of so many others. I've got a small gift for you.
Oh, thank you.
This is my new book, Live Ready, Beyond Think and Grow Rich. And Keith, thank you for being on our program today.
Thank you, David. I've read your first book. I was really impressed. I look forward to reading this one. But may I say, I appreciate the compliment you're giving me. But David, people like you have made this community really tick. And I must say, it's not only the Novoa family you've helped. There have been others I brought to you before. The Telechea young girl who came.
Right.
Who did so well at the University of Utah. And I just thank you for all the good that you've done in this community, and may God bless you as you go forward. May you do much more, and may you live a long life to do so.
Thank you very much.